Thanks very much, Deputy, and thank you, witnesses. I'll move on to Deputy Daly, who you have 10 minutes in total. Thank you.
Again, thanks to both contributors. I probably will direct more of the questions to Ms Sampras because I think her contribution was very evidence-based. We are dealing with changing our laws here. And, you know, I think, Professor Binchy, you are obviously very entitled to your opinion, but I think you did explain very well how that opinion is maybe at odds with practically every human rights body on the planet, with our own Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and indeed that you're at variance with the Citizens' Assembly. I do think you should correct the point you made, that the Citizens' Assembly recommended abortion for disability. That's not in any of the recommendations. You may need to read them again. But you have repeatedly referred to the fact that abortion is a violation of the unborn's right to life. If that was the case, why do you think then that no international or regional human rights body have ever found a country in violation of human rights by providing broad abortion?
Well, I think the reason is that the reason I gave you already, which is that these treaties are inherently political. They're negotiated politically in New York or in Europe, as the case may be, or whatever region we're talking about. And they have this conscious diplomatic language which is used, ambiguity of language which is used, so as precisely to allow states that have had, going back many years, wide-ranging abortion, and states that are against legalised abortion and protect the unborn child, to allow both of them to ratify it. That's the whole strategy that is used by those who are formulating the treaties. That, believe me, that's absolutely on record. That's not an opinion. That's an absolute acknowledged fact by anybody who's involved in the negotiation of treaties. You can read it, you can see it yourself, that when it comes to the area of abortion, there's a high alert in the discussions and tiptoeing in order to preserve the situation that countries would, because those who are formulating these treaties want these treaties to be implemented. If they were to have what might be regarded as a pro-life treaty, they would have relatively few ratifiers in the present international climate. And you're absolutely correct to say that in the international climate, particularly in certain quarters, there is wide-ranging support for legalised abortion. That's obvious. I mean, we wouldn't dispute that. The other point I would just say to you is I think you did say that I misdescribed the Citizens' Assembly recommendations. I actually said, when I said that there were recommendations based on disability, I did explain at the time that they described it, they didn't use that word at all, but they used the word fetal anomaly, serious anomaly. And are we going to be discussing whether Down syndrome, spina bifida, blindness, cleft palate, are they serious enough? You know? And would some doctors say yes, and would some doctors say no in those circumstances?
I ask you to just try and be a bit brief. I'm not being rude now, but we have a time limited, and you see, you could view it as an international political conspiracy where everybody are trying to orchestrate a position towards broad-ranging abortion provision, or you could interpret it that your views are very much out of kilter with established norms in terms of international human rights protocol, that nowhere actually is there a defined right to life before birth, if you like, which doesn't mean that prenatal interests can't be protected.
Well, I don't think you want me necessarily to play this tennis match much more, but if I were to, I would just simply send the ball back to you and say the treaties are drafted in a way to actually solicit the support of countries that are opposed to legalised abortion.
I know what you're saying. There is no recognised right to life before birth.
Absolutely, no, I disagree with that proposition entirely, because the support for those who ratify was actually sought specifically on the basis that the protection afforded to the right to life was entirely consistent with protection for unborn life. So it would be completely wrong, absolutely wrong, to suggest that all of these treaties are treaties that do not contain protection for the right to life of the unborn. Absolutely the reverse of that. These treaties were drafted in such a manner that countries which are against legalised abortion and do protect unborn children should be invited to support them precisely on the basis that they do protect unborn life.
Well, in that context, and you said the choice very starkly facing this committee is that it amounts to the option of wide-ranging abortion. Would you not agree that Ireland has an abortion rate pretty much the same as other countries where abortion is freely available, and that in actual fact the debate before us is whether people can access that abortion service at home, or whether the present status quo, which you seem to be defending, would lead to a continuing situation where the only people who can't avail of that are the ones who can't travel, the vulnerable women, maybe women with disabilities, women who are refugees, asylum seekers and so on. That is the choice, really. Do we allow people to access that health care at home, or do we prevent those who we allow them travel somewhere else? Those who can't travel, what's the answer to that? Do we detain them as they do in El Salvador, or I'm not sure how we do that.
Well, I mean, again, staying real. I think I'm correct in saying this, that the abortion rate, so far as one can actually assess these matters, and one has to be tentative from the actual empirical evidence here, the abortion rate actually of those Irish people who have abortions outside the country, there is strong evidence that it is actually lower than England, for example, by a considerable multiple. But that doesn't matter for the purposes you make. Are abortions taking place abroad? Yes, they are taking place manifestly, if we stay real. Are there any proposals to introduce limitations in that area? No. Is the short answer. You're right in what you say sociologically. You are right, and I'm sure you are right also in saying that there are disparities in certain circumstances which by no means explain the entire phenomenon between rich and poor. Your point is an entirely correct one. But isn't it fair to say this, that if what we are talking about is the protection of the right to life of the unborn child, if that is important, if it's not important, well then that point has huge validity. But if it is important, that distinction that you identify would not be a trumping point which would be a reason for actually introducing a facility in this country for taking the life of the unborn.
I find that interesting, and I don't want to engage too much with you, but I mean the very last point, and I would appreciate it if you dealt with it quickly, but you made the point when you were campaigning for a no vote in the marriage equality referendum, and you talked about equality earlier. You said true equality never requires the pretense that two relationships with different capacity are the same when they are not. It never justifies the imposition of false uniformity. Would you not think that the equal right to life of the woman and the unborn is in actual fact a pretense that their capacities are the same when they clearly aren't, when one is a born, living human being and one
Well, I have to say, I'm a little puzzled, because unless I'm getting very old and very forgetful, I don't believe I did say that.
Okay, well, it's attributed to you. But
well, no, but you don't have the quote. You don't have the quote there, do you?
On your I do, yeah. But on the substantial point.
Sorry, Deputy. Does it say that I said it? Because I know I didn't.
It does say that, yeah.
Who said? What's the relevant citation?
It is quoted in an article on marriage equality, but I think you're trying to deflect.
No, hold on a second. If I said to you, Daly, Deputy Daly,
Chair,
if I were to say to you that you said something specific and I gave a quotation.
Okay. For the purposes of today, then, I'll say you didn't say that then. That was my mistake, even though I know it wasn't. Can you answer the question that I asked you? Can you answer the question
I will first of all answer the question you asked.
Which is the life of a born woman, in your opinion, equal to that of a fetus, when there's a conflict of rights?
I believe that the right of all human beings, that every single human being has an equal dignity and inherent right to live. But I would say this, that in parliamentary dialogue at a committee meeting, an Oireachtas committee meeting, I think the questioner has to have some responsibility. And if a questioner attributes a specific quotation to a person that they're questioning, which isn't actually what they said, and I hope I'm not having a memory block here, but I'm absolutely fully confident that I didn't that I didn't say what you attributed to me. And if in those circumstances I am in some way treated as being a little bit fussy for objecting not to accept an entire quotation which you falsely attributed to me, with respect, I think I would encourage you that in those circumstances I'm entirely entitled to defend myself.
It might just be an idea to retract it in the short term, and perhaps you wish to interact.
Professor likes, we can certainly do that. We can exchange quotes later on. I noticed none of your contribution was referenced. We can deal with that now. Yeah. But just we are trying to deal here with guidance in terms of changing our legislation. I'd like to ask Ms Sampras, I mean, international human rights law is evolving all of the time. And we have a challenge here to change our law to be in compliance with that. Now, you did spend a lot of time dealing with, I think, the difficulties in that context, bringing about, I suppose, a restrictive regime or a reasons-based regime. I wonder, could you expand on that in the context of, would, say, legislation that we might bring in which might permit abortion in cases of, say, rape or fatal fetal abnormality or serious risk to health, would that satisfy our obligations under international human rights? I mean, you might deal with, when is it permissible under international human rights law, for example, to delay or withhold a pregnant woman's access to health-preserving medical care in order to preserve the fetus's life? Is it more acceptable if the risk to her health is less severe? How are those issues dealt with? I know you've had experience in El Salvador, but you may like to look at the area of when is it permissible under international human rights law to detain a pregnant person in a hospital or psychiatric facility in order to prolong her pregnancy. And maybe the other point that might be I think an important one to touch on, you did make the point in your submission that placing women at the centre does not mean that states should ignore fetal interests. And I think that is a very important point, and I'm wondering, could you maybe elaborate on that? How, say, could a state like Ireland protect both women and fetuses in the context of abortion law, and what is the best way of doing that?
Thank you. I'll go to your first question about grounds-based regimes and how they function. The only country in Europe, and when I say Europe, I mean the Council of Europe, so the 47 Council of Europe member states that has a minimum grounds-based regime that international human rights law speaks to is Poland. So Ireland has the second most restrictive law in Europe. Malta has a total ban, Ireland has a life exception, and Poland has these 4 grounds. And in each, the European Court of Human Rights, the cases that were referenced earlier by the Equality Commission, there are 3 cases before the European Court of Human Rights in regards to Poland's abortion law. And those were cases challenging, not asking for an expansion of the grounds, but the fact that these 3 women, separate cases, and 1 girl, did not get access to lawful abortion services in Poland. And in each of those cases, one was a case concerning a woman's health, one was a case concerning rape, and the other case was a fetal impairment case, which is essentially the grounds in Poland. And in each of those cases, women weren't allowed to access abortion. And in each of those cases, the women that experienced those violations were vulnerable women. One woman was a woman with a disability, another was a child, and another was a low-income woman. These are the people that restrictive laws impact. But basically, in each of these 3 cases, the court found violations of the European Convention for state failure to actually implement its law. And the court said, a right cannot be theoretical or illusory. It must be real and practical. And the state must put in practical measures so that women can access lawful services, and it didn't in these cases. And in 2 of the cases, the court found a violation of inhuman and degrading treatment for not actually allowing the women access to lawful abortion. It's very difficult to regulate a grounds-based abortion regime because they're usually, first of all, exceptions in the criminal code. So there's criminal liability, which creates a chilling factor. But it's also very difficult for the legislature to define specifically what a health risk is, and human rights bodies haven't done that, and neither has the European Court of Human Rights. And they tend not to go into a medical analysis of whether or not there's a health risk. They just don't like doing that because most of them are lawyers and not doctors or healthcare providers. So yeah, I think in every country, in New Zealand, they have the minimum grounds-based approach, and human rights bodies have heavily criticized New Zealand for its multiple provider authorization, kind of like they have something similar to the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, where you have to have numerous doctors approve, far less than Ireland's, but still they do have a requirement where numerous doctors have to approve, and it really impacts rural areas where the doctors just aren't available to approve. The CEDAW committee has called it a convoluted law that basically strips away women's autonomy and doesn't grant them really the right to abortion in the cases provided in New Zealand.
I suppose reasons-based legislation is kind of out of kilter, or certainly increasingly so, in terms of international best practice from the point of view of complicating access, and that the issue of accessing healthcare services is where the starting point is, which I think is something that the Human Rights and Equality Commission had that view, that we look at this from a health point of view.
Yeah, well, human rights bodies are increasingly recognizing that grounds-based laws actually create harm to women, right? So you have these recommendations that I had mentioned in my paper and are outlined in the detailed paper I think that you received, that show that they're actually calling for first trimester abortion on request. That's clear, and human rights bodies, the Children's Rights Committee, isn't delineating the grounds. They're just saying ensure access to safe abortion. So we're increasingly seeing a recognition of the problems with the minimum grounds approach.
So in the context of access to safe abortion, and say an Irish context, the option of travel, which was used as before, could you maybe, is clearly insufficient?
Well, no, I mean, human rights
to vindicate
are supposed
women.
To be implemented
It's
in the country,
insufficient
right?
from the point of view of vindicating women's rights.
Absolutely
just having
not.
the option to travel, or some women having the option to travel, and it introduces, I suppose, an extra discriminatory provision there.
Oh, absolutely.
Response, I think we need to bring, because I've given you considerable latitude.
Yes, and the Human Rights Committee in the Mellon and Wheeling cases were very clear on that. Travel actually caused further harm as well, that the woman was not treated equally like any other patient would in any other healthcare situation in the country, and she was stigmatized and forced to leave the country because of her condition.
Deputy
Just
Daly,
clarify,
Deputy.
because Professor Vinci did say, and I mean, we have to be evidence-based here, and I wouldn't like this issue hanging up. The quote is attributed to you.
Yes.
It is attributed to two of your colleagues as well. It was a press statement with a group of senior lawyers, yourself, Patrick Tracy and Shane Murphy, in your No Marriage Referendum campaign, and it's a direct quote which was covered in the CatholicIreland.net, so just...
Okay, I have to say, I confess I had forgotten about that statement because it was a corporate statement. I have to say that.
No problem at all.
I did sign it. I didn't actually write it, but that makes no difference.
No problem.
For clarification,
Perhaps the witness would like a copy.